Hey there, welcome to today's tutorial. Today we're going to be building an infinite scrolling website that shows an infinite list of anime cards. Now, once we get to the end of a, a list of anime, we fetch and we get another one and we just keep scrolling infinitely, hence the name Infinite Scroll. We're going to be building this using Svelte-kit server features and Svelte 5. So if that makes you excited as it excites me, I hope that you stick around and actually gain a few things. Now we're going to be using Tailwind to build this. So you should be familiar with Tailwind, HTML, CSS, stuff like that, because I won't be going over the markup very much, just the JavaScript, and I'll be explaining that with as much detail and fervor as I can. Now the video is going to be a short one, so let's hop right into it. Now, the first thing is you come over here and you open your command prompt. I already have mine open, but I'm just trying to show you how to get yours, especially if you're on a Windows system. So my command prompt is open, and I'm gonna go ahead and install the dependencies that we're gonna use. We're gonna be installing Svelte-kit, Svelte, and Tailwind CSS. Those are the only dependencies we're gonna be installing. So very light dependencies, and I'm gonna paste in this command, which says pnpm create svelte at latest my app. I'm going to change this to the name of the application that we want. And in our case, I'm going to be calling this Anime Vault. Now, if you do not have pnpm, you can use any package manager that you have, which is bun or npm. But I'm going to be using pnpm because that's what I use. And I think it's really fast. So now we're going to go ahead and run this by clicking enter. Now that's going to take some time to complete. But once it's complete, we're going to actually add Tailwind to this application. It's going to be a skeleton project because we only want bare bones scaffolding. So we're going to use the up and down arrow keys to select what we want, which is set skeleton project, and then click enter. Yes, we're going to be using TypeScript syntax, so we'll click enter on that. And you can use the space button to select these options. I'm going to be adding prettier for code formatting, and yes, we're going to be using the Svelte 5 preview. It calls it a preview and puts this unstable bracket with the exclamation mark because actually Svelte 5 is not in production yet. We've only just gotten a release candidate, but right now it seems to be pretty okay working with it, but you still shouldn't really push it to production yet. You can, but you really shouldn't. Now the next thing we're going to add Tailwind. Next, we're gonna go into the Anime Vault directory, and we're gonna install all the packages needed. Now that that's done, we're gonna go ahead and add Tailwind into this. And this is the command to do it: pnpm dlx spelt add Tailwind css at latest. And funny thing about this command, or the great thing about this command is, it's actually going to go in there and in our tailwind.config.ts file, it's going to specify the files that the tailwind config should watch, the tailwind should watch and apply styles to. So we don't have to do that manually, and I guess that saves us just a little bit of time. Now we're going to click enter, and that's going to run. Now that's done, we can click yes. No, we don't want your typography plugin, and it's now installing dependencies. Next, we're gonna open our directory in Visual Studio Code with this command, code and a period. Click enter, and that should take us to Visual Studio Code. Now that that's done, I'm gonna quickly open up my terminal and start the applications just to make sure that everything's working fine. And if we open our browser and go to localhost, we should see that everything's working fine. And yes, everything's working fine. We have successfully scaffolded our project. Now, before we start anything at all, I've gone ahead and put some assets that we're going to need for this project. And you shouldn't have to stress yourself. So you should go to my GitHub repository to download these assets so that you can use them in this project. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, and I hope you've downloaded your assets and put them in this static folder, let's get right into it. So first things first, we're gonna add some files into our routes and the library folder. For the routes in the routes folder, I'm gonna be adding a plus page.server.ts file. In case you didn't know, those are files that actually fetch data for our pages when they run. And in the library folder, I'm gonna be adding a new folder in that called components. And within the components folder, we're going to create two new files. One we're going to call animecard.svelte, and the other we're going to call spinner.svelte. There. Next, in the index.ts file that's in our our lib folder, we're going to add some types. Just going to paste that in, and we're exporting this type out of this file, and the name of the type is anime prop, and it actually defines what our API returns data as. Our API returns data as an array of anime prop objects, and this is exactly the properties that are on that anime prop object: an ID gets returned as a string, a name that's a string, and an image object which actually has the path of the image as this original as a string. It also returns the kind, whether it's a series or a movie, number of episodes, or the episodes aired, both are numbers, and a score of string. So nothing too complicated there. Next, in our page.server plus page.server.ts file, which is in the routes folder, we're gonna export a load function. Now, if you're new to Svelte or Svelte-kit, basically what a load function does is for the page that it's attached to, for the page that it's attached to, for that route it's attached to, it returns data that we from the server. It acts as a server for that particular route. We could fetch data from this function and return it to the route or the page that actually needs it, and use that to create some sort of markup. Now you may not get that at first, but perhaps if we should put this into action, you're gonna see. So first things first, we are gonna request some data from an API route or an API endpoint. We are going to be the API is Shikimori. It's a weird name, but this is where we actually get all our animes from. It's shikimori.1 forward slash API forward slash animes. And for this, you can see that there is this page query and limit that we can use to basically specify what we want. Now, if we were to say that we wanted the API to return the data in the order of popularity, then the first page would be all the most popular animes at that moment in time. And the limit it's gonna return 8 animes per request or per call. It's gonna return 8 animes. Now we can change that, but I like mine being 8. You can change that to 10 if you want. It's totally up to you. And the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna define a variable called let animes, and it's just a variable. It hasn't been assigned a value yet, so there's nothing to explain over there. And now the next thing is we're gonna have a try catch block where we say let response equals to await request.json. Now this is our request, and we're basically saying, okay, if that has happened, because this is basically blocking code. If this has happened, then instantiate animes, but do not evaluate it, and then we're gonna have this try catch block run once this is successfully run and return the response. And we want to get all the animes that the API has returned. And that's why we do let response is equals to await request.json. Now this JSON object, I really shouldn't be going over this because this is elementary JavaScript, but I'll do that. This JSON method actually just turns the response from JSON into a normal JavaScript object or array that we can actually use and assigns it to this response variable. And now we're going to say this anime is over here, this variable. Now we're going to assign it to response, and we're going to, if something goes wrong with this, we're going to catch the error and console.log the error. And finally, what I want to do is to return animes. Now, a load function must always return an object, and it must return a plain JavaScript object. And this returned object is what we can access from a page or a layout file. And next, we're actually going to access that and list it on the screen so you can see that we actually do have our data. Next, what we're going to do is just clear out this file entirely, and we're going to have some script tags. Again, if you're new to Svelte-kit, on a page file, we can actually run and execute JavaScript. And typically, that's where we receive the values from our page, from our server, when our server has returned data to us. So if we wanted to access the data that we returned from this um, server file, how are we going to do that? Well, previously in the past, we would have said something like export let data. That was the way we used to do it in Spell 4. We would have said export let data. But now, actually, this syntax is depreciated, and we're supposed to use the props. Let data equals, it's a rune, and we call it props, and we fire it off as a function. And data still has access to the animes object, so that's not really a problem. So I can say, you know what, just give me a second here. Let me make some markup for this, an unordered list, and we're going to map with an each block, each data dot anime data.animes because anime is actually an array of animes, as I said before. And for each one, we're gonna make a list item and say, you know what, just give me the anime name, anime.name. Also, if you're new to Svelte-kit, this might look a little foreign, but it's just so easy. How we map through things is different from, say, if you were coming from a React background where you'd actually have to put, let's say, data.animes.map, and then you return a component or an HTML element for each member of that array. Here it's a bit different. Here we use these pieces of log. I don't even know what they're like. Logic markup. We have others too, like if statement, await each if, and all of these are just spelt kit syntax, but they work the same way as you would think of a JavaScript map or mapping through an array in JavaScript. Like if if this is an array, for each of its for each of the entries into that array, we're gonna we're gonna assign this name to each entry in the array and then access a property over that single one. Now let me show you what we have over here. And yes, we do have a list of 8 animes: Shinjeki no Kyojin, Death Note, Full Metal Alchemist. I'm sure there are one or two anime fans watching. I'm sure you would have come across some of these. So yeah, it works. We have our data. To show you something, if we actually returned the data from the page.server.ts with types, we would automatically get type safety or type inference over here in our plus page.spelt file. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna import the prop from the index file that I put in the that was in the library folder. We're gonna be importing anime prop, and then over here, down over here, we're gonna be using type coercion and saying, as we return this object, we want this object to be returned as its property animes as an array of objects that have their type as anime prop. Now over here, if we come into our plus page.spelt file, you see that automatically we get the type. It says animes is is an array of anime prop objects. And also, just to show you, I will get the auto completion too that comes along with this. But we're gonna leave this as name. Alright, next we're gonna be building some markup, and we're gonna come into our plus layout.spelt file in our routes folder, and we're gonna do some things. First of which is we're gonna say, or we're gonna define a prop for this layout page. Now, before, as you can see, immediately the slot tag gets highlighted. Previously in SpeltKit, whenever we wanted to render a layout with a page, we would have to use the slot component to indicate where we wanted our how we wanted our layout to fit around the page or the pages that the layout has access to. But now slot is deprecated, and we can just go ahead and remove that, and we can go ahead and remove this too. And we can go ahead and remove these style tags. Now, this might look a little bit confusing, but you don't have to think about it too much, because how it works is just basically saying every page that the layout has access to, we want to render it. We're accessing every page that the layout.spell file has access to, and we're going to render markup around that page. Now, I'm going to go ahead and show an example. And so to actually render the children, we are going to be saying this is the syntax to render children, which is the pages that this particular plus layout.spell file has access to. And we can go ahead and put some layout around that, a nav bar and a nav bar. No, a footer. And in here, we're just going to write layout nav bar and footer, layout footer. Now, when we run this application, you're going to see that, well, let me do something extra and say, you know what, I want our background to be black and our text white. Black and our text white. And we're going to copy this class for this, and we're going to paste it over here in the footer. Now, you're going to see that when we render our page, or let's go ahead and run our application. When we render our page, we're going to have markup wrapped around this any page that this layout has access to. In our case, this plus layout spell file will have access to this plus page.spell file as a child, and it will render this list, this ordered list of animes in between this nav and this footer. Let's get into our browser, and we're gonna say localhost 51. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and copy that, and we're gonna come in here and paste that in. You can automatically see that we get our navbar and our footer, and they are wrapped around this plus page.spell file, or the markup that's in that plus page.spell file. So you can just think of whenever you're writing this syntax as, oh, the plus page.spell file that this layout file has access to is just a child component, and we could just render it in between, like we were just running, like we were calling another component and then outputting that to the screen. It's the exact same way that it works. And so this naming syntax is kind of more intuitive. I actually prefer it to the previous slot components that were there. So yeah, that's how that works. Now we're just gonna get rid of all of this and actually build the the actual layout that we want to use for this. Next, we're gonna actually put the layout that we want, and I'm just gonna go ahead and paste this. Now, as I usually said in my other tutorials, we're not gonna be going over styles. You should just go ahead and get the styles from my GitHub repository. But as you can see, we're using the images that are in this static folder. And one great thing about the static folder is that anything you put in there is just, you can access it relatively. You don't have to know the route. It's not it's You don't have to do all that dot forward slash stuff that we used to do back in the day. It's just relative. If I put a forward slash and I can match in in here, and then I can match any file that I want to import from the static folder, and in this case it's anime.png. I hope you actually got in your images, and we just define a header and a footer that's going to wrap around our application. Now our app is running. Let's go ahead and look at it in the browser. Oh, there's something wrong. We haven't put our styles in our app.css. So basically I'm saying that I want my body to have my body element, which is our whole page. I want it to have a background color of 0 and some gradient stuff that you don't actually have to worry about. And I said that I want my color scheme to be dark. Now if we go over here again and look at this, everything comes out perfectly fine. So don't worry yourself about the styles. This is not a CSS course. You should go over to my GitHub repository. It's in the description of the video, and you should copy your CSS and markup and paste it here. The only thing that I'm going to be explaining is Svelte and Svelte functionality and JavaScript. Thank you. And also, while you're doing all that, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to see more Svelte content. Now, if you come over here to our browser, you can see that we have a list of anime that we actually fetched from the server, but it's not rendered quite right. We're supposed to be rendering a card for every single anime, but we haven't made a component for that yet. We haven't written the markup yet. And we're going to do that in a component, in a Svelte component. And that component, we already created the file. It's called the anime card.svelte file. Now, first of all, I'm going to be importing the type anime prop from the library folder. Now, we've already talked about these types. They just specify how the object is returned. Now, if you're new to Svelte-kit, this script tag over here on top, at the top of this file, is how we run any JavaScript that we might want to run for an application. I mean, for a component, sorry. Very sorry about that. If the component, that's how we specify props, import things that we need, and in case we needed to run any JavaScript, we can do that all in the script file. That's why this import statement works. Everything here, I can write valid JavaScript in here. Now we're importing this type from anime prop, and we're saying that this anime card.svelte file is going to need some certain properties to get rendered. It needs an ID, a name, an image, a kind that's either movies or TV series, the number of episodes it has, its score, which is its rating, and the amount of episodes aired. And we're saying that this object is of type anime prop, and we're setting that equal to this props thing, and that's how we actually define props in Svelte-kit. Before it was something like this. We'd say export let whatever the name of the prop was, let's say name. But now you can see that, okay, let me not use something that conflicts, let's say size, whatever that means. We're getting these red squiggly lines, and they say we cannot use export let in runes mode, use props instead. This was the old way we used to do it in Svelte 4, but now this is how we define props. Alright, now let's get into actually writing the markup for this component. Alright, now let's go ahead and define the markup. I'm just going to paste all of this in. Now, the card is a div, and within that div, we have an image. We're pointing to, this is actually the base URL for image requests that we'll be making via this src attribute on the image. So every avatar card will have its own specific path in this base URL. And that's why this is the only specified thing. So it's https shikimori.1 / whatever, let's say Shinjeki no Kyojin image. And so that's gonna fetch the image for Shinjeki no Kyojin and of course render it. We're gonna be setting our alt tag to the name of the anime, and within another div in an h2, we're gonna be rendering out the name of this anime, its kind, whether it's a movie or a TV series. We're gonna be rendering an episode. We're gonna look at this now. It's actually an asset in the static folder. It's just a fancy image beside the episodes. And now, when our data gets returned, sometimes we get on the object we get episodes or episodes aired. Now both of them are numbers, but this is just a backend thing. And if we don't have episodes, we would actually like to render out episodes aired instead. And if we have episodes aired won't be there, and so we just rendered episodes instead. So it's episodes or episodes aired. And finally, we have the score and this fancy image beside the score beside the score number. Now let's go ahead and look at this in the browser. Oh, we can't see that yet because we actually haven't gone over to our plus page.spell file, imported and used this component. So now let's go ahead and do that. Import anime card. And instead of mapping out a data that animes, we're gonna be mapping out an anime card instead. And of course we have to pass the properties. So name will be equals to like this and say anime.name and actually go ahead with all the other properties like id equals anime.id. But I'm sure you're gonna agree that this is a bit, repetitive. And of course, Svelte-kit in its minimalist way gives us something that we can use instead. We can simply spread the anime object. My bad, three dots. We can just simply spread the anime object. And because every item or every property that we specified in this anime card props is available on this anime object, on this singular anime object, we can just spread and the types match so we don't get any type errors or type warnings. So now if we go to our browser, everything should be working fine. Go ahead and refresh this. Beautiful. But still, something's wrong. And of course, what is wrong is the class. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste the styles in. I already told you I won't be going through much styles. And I'm going to be changing this div into a section. Oh, sorry. Now everything should work perfectly fine. If we go over here, and that's the live demo running over here, but we're looking for the one we're actually building right now. And there's still something wrong. There's still something wrong with this. So what's missing is actually the encompassing markup that actually contains this section. And we're gonna go ahead and close that off over here. Again, I'm not gonna be going over the markup other styles. You can just go over to my GitHub repo and copy that. Now, if we go over and look at our application, everything should be fine now. And yes, it is. It looks exactly like the live demo. But if in our live demo, if we scroll down to a certain extent, we get a new batch of data. Scroll down again, we get a new batch of data. Scroll down again, we get a new batch of data. Scroll down again, get a new batch of data. You get the idea. It actually does have infinite scroll, but for ours, it doesn't work. Now, why is that happening, or how is our live demo doing it that it's fetching this data? Well, what happens is if we come up really slowly to the end of a list, we can see that spinning thing. Now the spinning thing is it's actually it's an element, it's a component. Whenever the spinning thing is in view, I'm gonna call it a spinner. We're basically saying, oh, we're at the end of a page, we're at the end of a list, and I want you to go ahead and fetch some more data. That's the logic behind this. And next we're gonna be implementing that logic. So next we're gonna come into the spinner.spelt component. If you haven't put two and two together yet, the spinner.spelt component is actually the component at the bottom of the screen that when it's in view we fetch new data. And I'm gonna paste in the markup. It's a div that has another div in it and an image, the SVG spinner that actually just spins infinitely. Now we can go ahead and check to see if everything's working well and if we get it at the bottom of our screen. Oh yeah, of course we haven't actually imported it into plus page.svelte. That's why we didn't see that. So we can come over here to the bottom and say spinner. And we can come up over here and actually import the component. And now we should actually see a spinner at the bottom of the page. And yeah, we actually get it here. Not centered, but of course we'll change the styles a bit later. Now let's get into, a little bit of the mechanics of how this works. Now in spells, there's something called a bindable or a bind. And a bind, you can use this bind or the idea of this bind to refer to a specific element or an instance of a component. In this case, we actually want to refer to an element, a HTML element, which is this div. We want to track this div, but there are a lot of divs on our page. So how do we know the exact one that we want to track? And that's this ancestor div here that actually encompasses the image. How do we know that that's the one that we want to track? And so Svelte-kit actually offers us a great way to do this. If you've actually written React before, you will know about the ref hook. The ref hook returns uh, a reference to an HTML element, and that's the same thing that the bind does when it's written like this. I can just come over here and say bind this equals to, and I'm going to set that to a variable name. Now, there's no variable that has been defined as ancestor. We see that straight away. So I'm going to actually come up over here in our script tag and close that up. And I'm going to say let ancestor. And this should go away in a jiffy. Yes, it does go away. Now I'm going to say that, we're working in TypeScript, lang equals TS. I'm going to say that this ancestor is of type HTML element, just to be sure. Now that we have this ancestor variable actually pointing to this div element, we can go ahead and try to track this div element using the intersection observer API. Now, if you did not know, the intersection observer API is actually something that comes with JavaScript. It's not a spelled feature. It's actually comes with JavaScript, and it's a very easy way for us to actually track the visibility of an element in our screen. Now, the first thing that an intersection observer API needs is an options object. And so I'm going to head to define one over here. It says options equals to root margin and threshold. Now, the root margin is basically saying that if this div that we're trying to track is contained within our screen, how much, how offset is it from the bottom or the top or whatever sides do we want it to be before we actually start calculating its width and height? And we actually want that to be 0. And then the threshold is basically saying how much of the div has to be inside our screen, has to be visible in our screen before we actually do run a callback function. You'll see how we can do that very soon. And me putting this as 1.0 means that I want I want it to be that every single pixel that this div has, the entire height of this div has to be visible before we actually run our callback function. Now, Now, the next thing, I'm going to go ahead and actually bring in a use effect rune or an effect rune. Sorry, that's a very React thing to say. We don't have use effect here, we have effect runes. And this is how you specify an effect rune with this dollar sign effect, and it takes in a callback function as its argument, as its first argument. Now, how effects work is they essentially track values that are used within the callback function that is specified in the effect. So anytime any value specified in the effect rune changes, the callback function is going to rerun. But instead of something like React, where you have an array that you actually have to specify the dependencies or the stateful values that you want the effect to track, here in Svelte does it automatically, which is a very, very good thing. Now, let me go ahead and explain the rest of the code. Because we're actually working with server-side rendering, Svelte-kit is by default server-side, or Svelte-kit pages and components are by default server-side rendered. When the page first loads, ancestor points to absolutely nothing. This bind doesn't work until a few seconds later. And so this effect then runs for the first time when ancestor gets initialized. Now, once ancestor gets initialized, once the div gets initialized, ancestor is no longer an empty variable. So this effect runs or starts up this observer for the first time. And now if I'm going to go into the observer syntax. Like how we specify this is by saying let observer equals to new intersection observer, and in that we will instantiate this intersection observer with a function and the options object that we specified over here. So we're saying every time we can see the ancestor object and it's 100% visible in the viewport, we actually want to fire this callback function. And we go ahead in this next line to say observer.observe ancestor. So we're pointing to our HTML element over here. So we're finally saying this observer that we have actually defined over here, we want to go ahead and observe ancestor. Now let's run our application and see if we get console.log working when we scroll down to the bottom of the page and our div would be in view. So we run our application by typing pm run dev and clicking enter. And moving to localhost 5173. Great, now it's loaded up. So let's go ahead and scroll to the bottom. We've gone to the bottom. Now let's inspect and see if everything works well. And it says working. If we get into view again, it says it logs out working one more time. If we scroll up again and we come down, it logs out working one more time. So our intersection observer is working perfectly and our div is getting tracked. Now, even in my workspace, you can see the console.log, what was console.logged. And now, if you think that this could help your developer experience, these getting these logs in your workspace without actually having to go to the browser to see what has been logged all the time, that's especially good with network requests when you actually have to interact with the web page. There's a very nice extension that does this for me. It's called Console Ninja. It's on the top right here. So if you like that little feature that I've got in my workspace, you can go ahead and download Console Ninja and enable it. Okay, that aside, obviously we don't want to be logging working when we actually scroll our div into view. What we want to do is to fetch new data and display that data. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to fetch data much like the same way we fetch data in our pluspage.server.ts file. Actually, the function we're going to use to fetch data is going to be an exact replica, only that it will have a parameter. Now, I do not want to define the I don't want to define the function that we're going to use to fetch data in this spinner.svelte file because it's going to make the JavaScript here look a little bit convoluted. It's already starting to look a little bit convoluted. So let's go ahead and create a new file in our library folder and we're going to call it utils.ts. Yeah, and within utils.ts, I'm going to go ahead and actually paste that function in and explain what it does. Now, the first thing here, the first line is we import anime prop from the index file in the library folder. And as I said, anime prop was just a type that specifies how the objects get returned from the API. And we define a function called fetch new data. It's an asynchronous function and it takes a parameter that has its type number and the name of that parameter is page number. So we're going to specify a request and say, hey, you know what? I want to wait for data. I want to wait for data to come back from this API before we do anything else. That's what our wait keywords are for. And now the difference between this and let me split my screen and the function in the plus page dot server is here we actually have a value or a dynamic value that is dependent on what we pass in this parameter as what page our API should go out and fetch. Whereas in pluspage.server.cs file, we hard coded it to 1. Go ahead and close this. I just wanted to show you that and bring back my files. So basically every time we want to fetch data, we want to pass in a new page number. And I'm going to do that on the front end. So I'm just now that I've gotten that out of the way, every time we pass this new number, it's going to fetch data for that new page number that we specified. And we proceed to do the same thing as we spoke about in pluspage.server.ts file. As I said, it's an exact replica function, so I'm not going to actually go ahead and explain the whole thing over again from the scratch. Now we're going to come into our spinner.spell component and import that function. So I'm going to come over here and say import fetch new data. And straight away we have that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a stateful value with props. I'm sorry, runes, the state rune. I'm so sorry about that. That was actually an actual mistake. I'm going to say let page number equals state, and we're going to initialize this as a value 1. We're going to clear this out. We're going to clear out the callback function for our intersection observer API. And instead, what we're going to say is we want to get, we want to fetch new data with the present page number. Whoops, better put it like that. And want to fetch that with page number. Good. Now, with the way that this application is right now, if we actually go into our page and scroll our div into view, we're going to fetch data that we already have. We're going to be fetching the data for the first page. Now, what we're going to do is immediately the ancestor gets into view, I'm going to say let the stateful value, let page number rather, equals, I can just say plus equals 1. Now, if you don't know what this is, by any chance you don't know what this is, it's equivalent to saying page number is going to be equals to page number plus 1. That's what this plus equals operator does for us. And so basically now let's go through the whole through the program flow and see if you understand what's happening. So when we specify page number and it has its initial state as 1, immediately we see the immediately we scroll the ancestor into view for the first time, it's going to say page number. And let's say we specified 2 in our fetch new data function. However, without running this, we should already think that, hey, fetch new data does return a, it actually does return value, but fetch new data is asynchronous, so it's going to take some time to do. And ideally, we wouldn't want to hard code this value into here. Now, would we? And we would also ideally want to have some sort of loading state that tracks whether we have new data or not. So the solution I actually found for this was to actually create another function that will instead call fetch new data and pass fetch new data some new value of page number whenever it gets called. I'm just gonna paste that in, and I'm gonna quickly go ahead come over here and define a prop called page number. Sorry, not a prop, it's a stateful rune, making that mistake. And we're gonna initialize it to 1. We're also gonna come over here with another stateful rune, say fetching equals to state, and we're gonna initialize this to being false. And last but not least, the last stateful value that we're gonna have is anime array. That we're gonna set that equals to stateful rune again, and we're gonna initialize it as being an empty array. All right. Now let's go through our function. So basically, this function, which is an asynchronous function that gets new data, when it runs, the first thing it does is to set page number, which is initialized as 1, to a value to a higher value, to the next value. So let's say we had actually already fetched the data for the second page and we scroll this div into view again, it's going to fetch data for the third page. And it sets fetching in equals true immediately because we're about to go ahead and try to fetch data. And so we set this request variable equals to the return value of fetch new data. And if we hover over fetch new data, we can see that fetch new data actually returns an array of anime prop objects. And then we go ahead to say, okay, if our fetch was successful, we want it that every anime in that array gets pushed to the stateful anime array. So every anime in this request array that gets returned from fetch new data, we want to push each and every one of them into our stateful array instead, because this this request variable and the request that animes properties property that it has on it is actually defined in this function scope. It's not defined in the global scope. So whenever we run this again, we're gonna have a different value of this array and no way to track it. And if you looked at the demo, whenever we scrolled down, we didn't lose the previous page. We didn't lose the animes that came from the previous page. They were still there. So we need something to track it in the global state, and that's why we use this anime array. And TypeScript is basically telling us we cannot assign type of anime prop to basically a plain array. So I'm gonna go ahead and import the type anime prop. Go ahead and import that type. And I'm going to say that anime array is going to be an array of anime prop objects. And now TypeScript doesn't throw any errors anymore. So immediately we're done fetching the data. We want to set fetching equals false, and we want to console.log error, an error if there is one. And so you can just merely come down here and specify get new data, and let me throw something in here as well. So let's say console.log. I want you to console.log the anime array once you are done. Sorry about that. Once you have run console.log the anime array, so we can check and see if everything works as it should. Now let's go to our app, give this a quick refresh. We're at the top now, and if I scroll to the bottom, we get a new array. If I scroll back up and I scroll down again, we get a new array logged in. And you can see that every time this happens, we get a bigger and bigger and bigger array. Now, don't worry about this proxy array thing that it's actually showing us in the console.log. The proxy array is just a way that Svelte-kit uses to transform the previous value of a state into its next value. So we have that data, and now all we have to do is figure out how we're gonna map it to the screen. And whenever data is loading, show this infinitely spinning loop. Now that we've seen that we actually do get our data whenever that div, the ancestor div, is scrolled into view. Now let's go ahead and actually output the data that we get, the new data that we get every time the ancestor div is in view. Let's go ahead and actually output that into the screen. So first things first, we're actually going to be importing the anime card component that we made earlier. I've done that over there. And then secondly, we are going to be creating a section above this ancestor div. And within that section, we are conditionally rendering anime cards. We're saying that if the the length of that stateful array that we have present that we had created before, if the length of that is 0, we're not going to render anything. If it's not 0, if it's greater than 0, then we want to render the animes in the anime array as anime cards, and we're passing in the data on each individual one when we spread out this when we spread out the props. Now, a way to think about this is whenever we scroll to the bottom of the screen, this section is above. Initially, it's empty, but when we get our first batch of data, it's going to become bigger and it's going to push this ancestor div downwards. When we scroll again to the bottom of the screen, this is going to become bigger and it's going to push the, the ancestor div downward. Now, there's one more thing, however. We want to show the user when data is being fetched. So I'm going to go ahead and use that fetching stateful value that we created before to conditionally render this spinner image. So I'm going to say if fetching render this div that has the spinner image within it. So now let's go ahead and try out our application and see if everything works. And straight away, we got the application as cards. We scroll down all the way to the end, we get it again, and you can see that now it's only when data is actually being fetched that we see that spinning image. And that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll do the channel a lot of good because there aren't a lot of Svelte and Svelte-kit developers out there. Uh, just keep trying to encourage me to so I can keep making this. On my last video, I promised that I was going to make something with Svelte 5. I did make something with Svelte 5. I have delivered on that promise. So please and please just show some love to the channel and I'll be sure to get back to you with some awesome content real soon. Thanks guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. Have a nice day.